Talk about some of the things that came up in your conversations. Any points that you'd like to share out loud? Any huzzahs? Any like, oh, I didn't think about that, or this is where we found commonalities. So yeah, a little bit of a harvest. Anybody would like to share?
I'll share what Amber and I came up with, because I think, well, she went really much deeper than I did, but then, we had both distilled it, some pretty interesting things. So for what liberation means, I just said it was the act/process of becoming free of erasing barriers, and Amber said being free of fear, being seen, being connected. And then who it's for, I said anyone who's encumbered, who's limited by bondage. And she said everyone, yeah. And then what it looks like, I said it looks like self-determination. And yeah, that's basically what she said too. It's looks like free of behaviors that have hurt people.
Cool. Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
And she also mentioned that it is also for, the liberation is also for animals and plants
Anyone.
and like other living beings.
All living.
Without self-determination.
Absolutely. Awesome, thank you.
Thanks.
Cool. Anybody else want to share? You don't have to give me the whole rundown. Give me a bit of piece. I also like the rundown.
When I think about liberation, I think about social systems that are oppressive and how to move past those. And so for me, capitalism, patriarchy, imperialism, and colonialism are kind of the big ones. And so what I think within that, it's also important for me to keep at the forefront of my mind that liberation struggles, those social systems primarily negatively impact BIPOC, trans, and queer communities. So those communities have the right to lead their own liberation. And then the way that I see that I fit into that is by supporting those struggles. So I do think that it's kind of important as like a white person to just really make sure that that remains as part of, if I'm looking to work for liberation in general, that's kind of the lens that I like to see it through, is by supporting these other, communities that are much more impacted by these systems than I am, and making sure that they are leading the way.
Awesome. Great. So I feel like, what's a part of that definitely too is self-determination, right? And I think self-determination of communities who are most impacted by these structures. And that's not to say, and so I like this just kind of juxtaposition about both your answers, because I do think that like liberation is for everyone, and that looks differently at different times for different people, right? And so I think that's also part of it is, I think, neoliberalism kind of teaches us, like, everybody should be treated exactly the same, and we all should have the same, and that's what equality is that everybody gets the equal parts, but the reality is that, context is everything. So depending on what systems people are dealing with, where they live, how they live, what they have access to, what they don't do, impacts like how they're able to self-determine, right? And so it's the both and. It's like we're reaching so that everybody can get here, and understanding that different people have different work to do to get there. Right? Awesome, thank you. Cool. Other things that people wanted to share?
Well, we talked a little bit about liberation of the oppressor also, which
Yeah.
is an important thing.
Absolutely.
How we can, people can be supported. Don't put that on me.
I didn't ask for that. You just hear my voice. I will be the ominous receiver of the voice.
Oh, she's not going to do it. Then she did it.
I love boundaries.
But you being there, and it's an educational process, teaching people how to look at these things. And then when they do pop up, how we, think about it, and like, oh gosh, no, I don't want to go that way, and change our direction, the way of thought. But understanding where it came from, because a lot of this, we have to have some self-forgiveness,
Absolutely.
and I think that's really difficult for people, and it's a big barrier.
Yeah, for sure.
Because, hey, that's the way it is, it's the way my grandparents were, blah, 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 blah. And understanding, yeah, it was, but doesn't mean it's good, and yeah, you did all those things when you were younger, or whatever, doesn't mean it was good. Where can we go from here?
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's like part of amplifying that is understanding that, that everybody has a part in this whole, and that, the different people have different work at different times. And I love that you said, like, this self-forgiveness and this compassion of, which I think is part of, like, that praxis, like, this reflection of, okay, this is how this was, and I'm seeing what that means now and today with the information I have. And so, like, we can stay there and stay in the guilt, or we can, like, use that to move. And I think it's hard, because you have to also, like, we're not taught that. We don't teach young people that. We definitely, the longer you have habits, the harder they are to break, right? And so we don't have a schooling system that does that. So, like, what do we do as our communities to teach each other about that kind of unlearning process? So, thank you. Anything y'all would like to add? You don't have to.
I liked what you shared about the wombats.
The wombats.
Toward the end, I got like a little stream of consciousness, but with the Australian fires, I was reading that the wombats have these big underground complex tunnels that they're using, like opening up to all the other animals that are escaping the fire and helping everybody like get out of the fire by using the things that they built for themselves, but now because of this urgency, they're doing something they've never done before.
Wow, I love that.
So
Wow, that is great.
Yeah, isn't that magical?
I was going to make a little thing for my clinic Facebook page about being a wombat.
Yeah,
that's
That's
great.
really relevant.
So
to
good.
Discussion.
Right?
I mean,
Great.
it is. It's all about, helping. I mean, they couldn't do anything for the kangaroos, but, they did things for the little things, and even if it's not true, I don't care.
Yeah.
We won't
Yeah.
I will say, I feel like it's totally true. I've been to Australia, and it is a very magical place. So I want to believe that the wombats have definitely been doing that for sure. Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
That's
Anything
great,
else?
because it's just like that's kind of just makes me articulate a different idea about liberation. It's imagining the unimaginable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally. And that's a great point. So that's why I had to start with like self-reflection just to start, because one, I think it's always important to figure out where you're going, got to know where you came from. And also I think that like this practice of imagination or thinking, that's why I asked the question of like, what does it look like, smell like, taste like? Because if we can't imagine it, then we can't make it, right? And because we live in a society and particularly schooling structure that doesn't teach young people to imagine. We kind of like stomp it out of them. We have to reclaim those things, right? And so we have to like kind of flex those imagination muscles so that we're like, okay, we can hang on, like down with prison, right? Okay, so we have all these things. Cool. So, all right, so I'm going to move into talking about some history and context. So this is the part that I'm very, very jazzed about. So first I'll kind of talk about some of the larger kind of tenets of liberation acupuncture, and then kind of talk about some storytelling around where that kind of came from. So part of that is some of the commitments are social and economic conditions impact health, right? And so like if you are experiencing poverty, if you're experiencing these systems of oppression, that can have an impact on your physical, mental, spiritual health, right? So understanding that those things are not separated. That health is a social and not just an individual concern, right? Meaning that like what happens to the collective impacts us all, and we live in a society that has a very individualized healthcare system, right? Like you and your concerns apply to you. Society should promote health as via social means, so meaning that like right now we have this very individualistic way as a society of dealing with healthcare, whereas I'm like, basically this is another way of saying healthcare is a human right? Like everybody deserves to have healthcare. And on a social level we should be addressing that. It centers oppressed peoples, and it's based on praxis, and we'll have a whole other point to kind of talk about praxis. But so liberation acupuncture often cites like the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. And so the Black Panthers were a political organization in the 60s and kind of dissolved by the 70s. And the Young Lords were kind of, were basically a little bit after the Panthers had dissolved, had kind of sprang up. So basically, the Black Panthers started doing these social programs, right? So now the media painted the Black Panthers to be like this violent gang who was like trying to make, who were attacking people and inciting violence, when the majority of what they were working on were social welfare programs for their communities. And they had a 13-point plan in which they had these kind of politics in which they said, these are our commitments that we have. And one of them happened to be armed struggle. And because of that, the media kind of took it as like, oh, there's these folks walking around with guns, they're bad, right? So the Young Lord organization were a group of young Puerto Ricans. The Young Lords started in Chicago. They were a former gang, and they turned into a social organization when they recognized that the government was not responding to the needs of their community, and so they were like, how do we take this in our own hands? They were inspired by the Black Panthers. The founder of the Young Lords, his name was Cha-Cha Jimenez, and he had met Fred Hampton after he was incarcerated, and was kind of politicized by him and really excited about what the Panthers are doing. And Fred Hampton said, you should organize your people. Like, we have similar overlaps, but like there are also concerns your community has that mine doesn't, so organize your community. And so it started in Chicago. Then a group of young activists in New York, who some of them were college educated, but were from like the Bronx, went to Chicago to meet this guy. We're like, we're super excited about this thing you're doing. Can we do this in New York? And they were like, cool, and gave them permission to start a chapter. And they basically started these social welfare programs. So part of it was addressing health concerns. So one of the big things that they did was start a free breakfast program and a daycare program in a local church. And so I'm going to show you this clip that is from a documentary called Palante, which is the Young Lords documentary. And it talks about some of those social programs they were doing, specifically the health ones. And it has a little bit of an overview, so it's like about 3 minutes. And yeah. And then I'll contextualize some of that somewhere. Okay. Let's put up good sound. Let's see if they have captions. No, that's not what I want. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't think this has captions. But I'll try to put it as loud as I can. Okay.
Yeah, but we'd have to do it from over here. Which, we just move it back to the podium, I think.
While the Young Lords have occupied the church, one, the First Spanish Methodist Church is empty 6 days a week. Two, it has the largest space available for community service programs. Let it be understood that we never ask, these are the myths that must be destroyed right now. We never ask to take over the institution. We never ask to control the church. We only ask for cooperation in terms of running a breakfast program for needy children. We'd like to make it very clear, however, that this is going to happen to any institution and any oppressed community that does not respond to the needs of the people.
In New York, the Young Lords continued to grow and directed their efforts to community health issues. They launched a lead poisoning detection program.
Denise Oliver. Ultimately, we found out that about a third of the children in East Harlem had high levels. And
So this is the lead poisoning detection program that they
legislation was
started in
passed
their
here in
community.
New York City, banning the use of lead-based paints in tenements, in apartment buildings. also a law was put into effect that landlords would have to go back and take that lead paint out of the apartments, which has not been followed up on.
Nikki Melendez. We have been doing TB testing throughout the community projects, housing.
And then they talked about TB testing. There was a truck that was doing testing, but it would never come to the neighborhood.
The city at the time had this TB truck that it would park in very obscure places, and maybe they would see 20, 30, 40 people a day. We got into negotiations with the city of saying, why park it there? We have a location, we'll get the people that have tested positive the week before, because we would go out every Saturday and do the TB testing. Anyway, to no avail, they wanted to park the car, their truck, where the people parking it, and they were not ready to budge from it. We planned an action, we took over the
Stole the
TB truck.
Into the community because though they were not servicing the community at that time, they were servicing other areas in the city.
That day, we had over 150 people taking x-rays. The technicians stayed there, and we're very pleased on how we dealt with the situation.
So they stole the truck, but convinced the technicians to keep working the truck. And they saw maybe 20 people a day when they parked at other places, and they saw over 100 people that day.
Wow.
They targeted Lincoln Hospital, the sole facility available to the people of the South Bronx.
That building was condemned 25 years ago. Condemned because it was unsafe for human habitation. Condemned for rich people and opened up for poor people. That's what always happens.
The Young Lords took over Lincoln Hospital to address community health issues.
Mickey Melendez. The politicians and the city administration had earmarked monies for a new hospital. It was taking 10 or 15 years. In the South Bronx at the time, in 1970, the statistics were something like 1 out of every 5 people were addicted to heroin.
Vicente Alba took over Lincoln Hospital. And the second time we took it over, we started a drug program called the Lincoln Detox.
We would see an average of 600 to 700 people a week at Lincoln Hospital for those first couple of years that we were doing that. We would put people on a 10-day detox.
In 1976, a new Lincoln Hospital was finally built in the South Bronx.
Excerpts from the documentary Palante Siempre.
So this is from Democracy Now! They did a great little...
Is that the name? What's the name of this documentary?
The documentary is called Palante.
Palante.
Yeah. Palante? Yeah. Let me see how to spell it. Palante. Palante, siempre palante.
Oh,
Siempre.
okay.
So it's like both.
Thanks.
Yeah, totally. And so they did a clip on Democracy Now! Because one of the co-hosts from Democracy Now! Is actually a former Young Lord.
Yeah.
So they did a big special. So the community acupuncture kind of like movement that says like, oh, the Young Lords and Panthers started this thing. They're talking about Lincoln Detox program, right? So basically, folks in New York, right, in the late 60s, early 70s, were addicted to heroin. And this is when methadone first came out. But then they were realizing in their communities that then people were just addicted to methadone, right? And we're talking about young people, former Young Lords. The one guy who said, we took over the hospital, we started a drug program. I was reading this article where he was talking about being, started heroin at 14. And so at 19, he was like still a young person, addicted to heroin, not knowing what he was going to do. And he met the Young Lords and basically was like, okay, am I going to be an addict or I'm going to be a revolutionary? And he got inspired. He was like, I want to be a revolutionary, right? And so what this was happening, there was no community response to this addiction crisis. And so basically, when they decided to take over the hospital, and so like the origins of the story are a little fuzzy. Like some folks are like, someone went to Chinatown and they tried this acupuncture thing, and it worked. So we stole a bunch of needles and started experimenting and figuring it out. Now, ultimately, there was a group of the Rainbow Coalition, which were the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, and the Young Patriots, who were radical white folks, who got a cohort together to actually get trained in acupuncture, and so they went to Montreal to go to acupuncture school, and some of them did eventually go to China to study. But they were noticing that, you know, deep acupuncture, right? All the detox points are in your ears. And so it was a way that they were like, this is a non-invasive way that we can start addressing addiction in our community, and started hosting this clinic where they would see people do the detox points in the ears, and because it was a free program, people could keep coming back and ultimately kick the habit. And so that was like the first type of community acupuncture that happened in the country, of saying we have a group of people who need to have this issue addressed, and we see that acupuncture works, so how do we make it free and accessible, right? And everybody got treated in the same space, and they ended up taking over this hospital for many weeks, and eventually, you know, the police raided it and disbanded them, but that was like a huge, and that along with the TB truck and the lead poisoning initiatives were the only initiatives. Like, the government wasn't doing any of these initiatives, right? And so, especially the lead initiative ended up making policies around, you know, having to, like, okay, now we can't have any lead paint in these apartments, things like that, right? So that is like the big, like, kind of like of what community acupuncture kind of started as and envisioned as. So when I think about like this kind of story, so then, you know, once people are like, oh right, we want to make it affordable, we want to understand that these folks in our community, their health is being impacted because their needs are not getting met, and so this is how we're meeting them. So yeah, I guess like I was like, pop quiz in my thing. What do you think liberation meant to these folks? Do you think it overlapped with the ideas we talked about? Do you think it was different? Yeah, like what do you, and who was centered in their ideas of liberation? You feel like
yeah, it's super inspiring. I just feel like just the fact that in that documentary they were like, well, we stole this truck and the workers and just like went to this other neighborhood, and they like like there were so many more people that like needed TB testing and everything, and yeah, I feel like it's an important thing to remember. Like I've been volunteering with Southside Harm Reduction with like this verbal contingent, and people are like a lot more scattered now that are living on the streets, because that's what there's like a lot of sweeping going on by police and stuff, but just like knowing that there's like a lot of people that don't have access.
Totally.
And that was like really rad that they were like, okay, we're bringing access to people right now.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's so magical about what they did is that it wasn't like these young people got jobs at nonprofits.
Right.
And then we're like, cool, this nonprofit has this program where I'm paid to do this thing. Like, they weren't organized like, oh, you're oppressed and I'm not, so now I'm going to organize for you. It was like, this is our communities, these are our moms, our aunts, and our siblings and our kids. So, like, we have to do it. Like, they were the oppressed people that they were organizing for. And so I think that's always important to, like, kind of notice, like, when we're talking about our own practices, like, who are we serving and why? And we may or may not be serving people in our own communities, and that's okay. But also being clear about, like, why and how, and, like, where do we fit in our own identities as to, like, how that informs how we're serving, right? Because if, for example, if you are, if you own a clinic that sees mostly people of color, what does that mean versus if you're in you're in a clinic that serves mostly other, like, white folks, right? Like, and what is the work that you're doing there? And one of them is not better than the other. It's just different work, right? And so understanding, like, where your positionality informs your different work. So that's any questions or reflections from that?
Well, I just like, the reminder that, I mean, what's happening is they're coming from a view of their own neighborhood, and they can, from that view, it's so simple to say, this is what we need and this is where we can get it.
Yeah,
You know,
for
it's
sure.
not complicated, you know?
Yeah.
And just shows like how important it is to listen to, you know, to people instead of trying to do for people, you know, which is kind of how our healthcare system is set up.
Absolutely.
Supposedly to be doing for people.
Supposedly, right?
Yeah.
Totally. Right, so it's a different orientation to how we're doing care work, right? So, awesome. So we're going to move into this activity that is, I'm going to ask you to move around a little bit, but don't worry, I'm not going to make you do any jumping jacks or anything. And this will be an opportunity for us to reflect on some of our own identities and kind of help us kind of think about where liberation fits into our own positionalities. So, if you'll see around the room, my lovely good friend Cyrus helped me put these wonderful signs up on the wall. So these are different social markers, different social identities. So we have race and ethnicity here, education, citizenship, language, spirituality, and that far corner we have socioeconomic status or class, age, ability, so that's like a physical ability, sexual orientation, and in this corner we have gender. So basically, I'm gonna ask a series of questions, and then you all are gonna go stand under the identity that is most applicable to that. So we can probably pause the video for